Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. A few details about this podcast before we get started. Details about this podcast episode and more can be found at zachbitter.com. My website is where you can find all details about the podcast, including episode notes, links, timestamps, and a full transcript. You can also find my social media channels and newsletter sign up there. If you want to support the show and also gain access to an intro and ad-free audio version of every episode, as well as early release, consider joining the show Patreon page. You can also access my coaching services, which include my virtual group coaching package, products that I use, my Amazon storefront, which highlights a wide range of training and racing items that I use. Please consider sharing episodes you like on social media, liking, commenting, and writing a review. It really goes a long way in reaching new listeners. As a way to thank listeners who engage, I am raffling a 30-minute consultation with me every month for anyone who shares, leaves comments, and reviews the podcast. Just remember to tag me or send an email to hpopodcast@gmail.com to let me know if I'm not already tagged so I can add you to the raffle. Also, if you have suggestions for show topics or guests, you can also send those to that email address as well. Finally, a big thanks to S Fuels, John G, Delta G Ketones, and Element Electrolytes for sponsoring this podcast. Links and discounts to these brands can be found in the show notes as well as at zachbitter.com. I also left a more formal description of each of these brands at the end of the episode. All right, let's get into the show. Joe, welcome back.
Dude, great to be here, Zach. I love talking about all the exciting things in ultra running, and man, there's been a lot of exciting stuff since the last time we recorded this. So we were just going through like all the stuff we could talk about, and I was like, wow, this could be like a 3-4 hour episode. So I'm excited.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, we might have to practice a little brevity with the topics we have on hand, but I think it's fun to unpack some of the stuff. And one we didn't actually chat about because I felt like it was kind of a no-brainer, but it's also one that is getting far enough back that I think we just missed it on our last recording. It was kind of in between. Was Katie Schide's UTMB. We didn't talk about that on our last one, I don't think, did we? It was
No, we did not.
Before that.
I think it was it was right before that, which is, definitely something worth talking about for sure.
Yeah, it seemed to me that was like a performance that was, Katie Schide this year, I think, is like when her performance at Western States was obviously close enough to Courtney's time and then breaking the course record at UTMB. It felt to me like the sport took a step towards where I think the men's side of the field has been at for a bit now, where if those two are on the starting line of the same race, it's no longer, well, it's Courtney's race to lose, or you can't necessarily have the kind of like the Tiger Woods effect of golf where it was Tiger versus the field for such a long time. It was like kind of Courtney versus the field where like you either bet on Courtney or everybody else, and that would be kind of how that would play. Now it's like, it's almost, in my opinion, I would probably feel compelled to look at what they had been doing prior. And if it was something where one of them was peaking for, or the way I like to look at this is like if one peaks for Western and the other peaks for UTMB, I'm betting on the peaking, not the person any longer. And I think that's maybe the first time I'd be willing to say that for someone other than Courtney.
100%. Yeah. And you make a lot of good points there. Like, I think, like she has had the Tiger Woods effect where it's like, she's the clear bet in every scenario. But now people are asking the question. They're like, can we compare Katie to Courtney? Like, how would she compare like in a race, like into there too? So that would be a cool showdown to see too. It's very interesting. Like, I think Coop put out a post because, she's obviously coached by Jason Coop. Coop put out a post on like all like the things that she did differently in training, like leading up to it too. And I remember there was like a lot of really cool kind of things in there. Like they were like talking about having her do like more higher running volume because she was doing like a lot of cross training, but they got her to like run a lot more, which is cool. They looked a lot more at like her nutrition, like holistic side of things, like protein consumption and just overall just getting that dialed in a lot more targeted strength training, which is really cool because I saw that and it's like, okay, like Katie made this like she's just been progressing year after year, and to see her like go this next step up, right? In the world of, if you remember our first Ultra Updates, we talked about like the developments in the sport with like super shoes and high carb, like none of that was really mentioned in there. It was all like just doubling down on like the basics, right? It's like solid running training, getting in better nutrition holistically, like, and both also too, like, outside of the running, strength training, right? Like all things like that we know that are really important for runners. But it seemed like she just like had like a much more intentional thing according to Coop's post, and to see her like, start to edge the point where she's like meeting Courtney. It's like a cool thing, I think, for athletes to look at, because we're always looking at some of the things that I think professional athletes at a level like that, to like the average person, is not going to move the needle because they're very much like 1 or 2% things. But it's really cool to see like Katie taking like the big, like, movers of the needle that can happen to any athlete, and just doubling down on those and then getting to where she's at. I thought that was just such a fascinating thing too. But I do agree. Like, I think if Katie and Courtney go toe to toe, I don't think it's a dead win conversation anymore for Courtney. I mean, I still think like she's got a chance, but Katie just seems to just get better and better and showing no signs of stopping along the way, which is, I think, such an exciting thing for the sport.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting thing about her too is, especially with the Western States performance this year,
Mm-hmm.
was it started showcasing kind of like at this point now, you kind of have to look at the athlete's history a little bit more specifically too. There's
Mm-hmm.
always going to be kind of the important things that are going to apply to almost everybody, but with Katie specifically, it's like she's a little more kind of grew up, or not maybe grew up, but she's spent a lot more times over the last few years, like kind of doing more UTMB style, kind of a lifestyle where, like you mentioned, a lot of cross training, a lot of like more steep mountain type stuff,
Mm-hmm.
whereas Western States is got a lot of running to it. So I think like, yeah, when you're looking at taking her from what was a world class performance the year prior to a whole nother step forward and getting into the 15s this year, you're looking at, like, probably getting a little more specific to that course, which is just gonna be more running for her, getting used to that, and it seems like it worked. And then when you're gonna try to double the way she did at Western and UTMB, I think it's a unique scenario for her too, because since she's got a background on that course, she can probably lean on those strengths a little bit more specifically, whereas for
Mm-hmm.
Western State, she kinda has to carve out a new adaptation process towards those specifics, but she can kind of turn it around maybe with proper recovery after Western States and not feel like she's got, the a full like calendar buildup need to prepare for UTMB, which is maybe why we saw her break that course record after her next level Western States performance.
Right, 100%. And that's a good point of like her having that mountain background too. And one thing I'm curious, I'd love to hear your take on this too, is because being in that environment, being in the mountains and stuff, does that, even though it's not like as specific to Western States, right? Because Western States is that California carpet, very runnable kind of stuff, right? And UTMB is like steep, alpine. Of course, you get a little bit of the alpine stuff early on in Western States, but for the majority of that part where you need to close, it's very, very runnable stuff. I think about 2 years ago, and even last year too, arguably, like when you look at Javelin 100, right? It's a very runnable course. And then you got guys like Dakota Jones there, who's, he's top of the podium at Hard Rock, very, very mountainous guy. He comes out and just blasts Pat Reagan's course record that had stood for time. And this was a guy who was like, he's a mountain runner, right? And even last
Mhm.
year, looking at John Ray, like on that side of things. And so I think like, I'm curious to hear your take on this. Is Katie's, you know, such close proximity to the mountains in France, living in that area, do you think that leads to like her just being a stronger on that runnable kind of stuff as well? Like how do you feel like that stuff translates? I'm super curious.
Yeah, I think the argument there for her would be, since she's historically done more kind of cross training, mountain style training type stuff, the volume that she's probably put
Mm-hmm.
in, like holistically outside of just running, is probably quite high. So then what it becomes is like, how do we match that massive cardiovascular development with the skeletal muscle side of being able to
Mm-hmm.
run for as long as you're going to have to do, and the downhill runnable stuff on Western States, which can chew your quads up, and then dealing with the heat. So for me, which I think is really a shorter window improvement need there. I think like if you're cardiovascularly fit, and then all you have to really do is get your legs ready for the specifics on a
Mm-hmm.
course like Western States, that's going to be a much shorter timeline. You can do that in like a peaking phase. Whereas if it's the other way around, if you're just like, okay, I've been a runner historically, my overall volume has been lower because I haven't been doing cycling, skiing, and things to supplement it to get those higher volume training weeks, then you may have a longer term development phase because you have to actually expose yourself to that cardiovascular side of the development for a little bit longer than you
Mm,
would have to. So maybe, I mean, it seems goofy to kind of say like, oh, well, maybe Jim needed to be out in, because that'd be like kind of the men's version of that, like Jim winning Western States and then trying to
mm,
go out and win UTMB. It's kind of like the reverse scenario in that regard, where his background is running. You know, not a lot of cross training outside of maybe some cycling and hiking,
yeah.
but really running, a running purist for the most part for most of his development. And then he had to kind of learn the long, slow mountain hiking side of things a little bit more specifically, and then maybe weave in some cross training so he's able to ratchet that up a little bit without taking the punishment that your body's going to take from trying to run you around at that level of volume. So yeah, I think I guess the question you're probably asking is it easier to have a background with kind
Mm,
of UTMB style lifestyle and then come over and peak for Western States, or is it easier to have a background that would lean you towards Western States and then fine tune your UTMB? I think it's going to be easier to go UTMB to Western States. Uh,
mhm,
I think because we're talking about long enough distances here where all these people likely are likely fast enough where that's not going to be a variable, that it's going to be a variable. It's going to give you opportunities to make more mistakes potentially, but
mhm,
it's not going to be an end all be all the way it would maybe be if you were talking about like a runnable course that's shorter, like Olympic distance, where, you know, if you don't have the speed
mm.
reserve, you're just not going to get to the times that we'd be looking at from a world class level standpoint. And then the skill set becomes something where you could work on and improve upon, but the actual high end of what you're capable of genetically and background wise is going to be a bigger factor.
Yeah, 100%. And as you're kind of talking to that too, like I agree. I think UTMB to Western is probably going to be the biggest one. I think about it almost like the repeated bout effect for like downhill running, right? It's like you look at that, you really only need, like studies show, like a couple, maybe two, three hard downhill sessions to get a pretty significant adaptation, right? And you think
Mhm.
about like what that body's going to do, at a race. Like I always say, like anytime I race like javelina versus like a mountainous race, like I'm always way more sore after javelina. Like it's just that running is just a little bit more harder on your body. And I think about that. It's like you have that short window where it's like maybe it's a similar thing like the repeated bout effect where you just, really condense maybe just a few weeks of just running training on top of all the cardiovascular stuff that you built on top of that. I think it's a way easier transition to go from like, being that purest runner to then like trying to cram in, because I think even historically, like looking at people who have maybe trained or had like these running backgrounds and they kind of almost go a little bit of a cram into UTMB or like just try to like just up their vert. It seems like that's always a little bit harder of a transition for some athletes that I've seen out there too. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting thing too, and to see that like kind of play out and like some of these like really great UTMB athletes just doing well, coming into Western States or UTMB like peaking training. Like that's a cool thing that I would definitely like to be curious on in terms of like what are these athletes like peaking for and everything like that too. And it'd be cool to see Katie go for the triple too, like the Western
Yeah.
Hard Rock, and compare the times. I think that would be a really cool thing I'd love to see over the next few years as like a wish list in the sport.
Yeah, you'd almost have to compare times, although you'd get the arguments about weather and course variance and
Right.
things like that with those type of comparisons, but it'd be kinda like the Grand Slam, right?
Yeah.
I think the days are over. I don't think what Courtney did with those 3 wins will be done again.
Mm,
I think where we're at now is it's almost impossible for the men's side of the sport to do a Western States UTMB win. I think that's unlikely. I'm never gonna say impossible, but I think that's very, very unlikely. I don't think I would never come close to betting on that happening. In fact, I would actively bet against it. If someone wins Western States on the men's side and they're doing UTMB, I'm gonna bet against them all day long for that
mm,
scenario. Whereas kind of like I was saying before, that wouldn't have been the case had it been Courtney in the past or maybe Katie. Now I think that the women are getting much closer to that, where that sort of scenario is probably gonna be off the table. It's just gonna take maybe 1 or 2 more people like Katie and Courtney to make it such that someone is always gonna be doing one or the other, and then it kinda becomes like then you're just hoping for someone to make a mistake versus you having your best day. Uh, and you throw another race in the middle of that with Hard Rock, now all of a sudden it's just getting more and more complicated to, because now you have 3 events you have to hope everyone else is avoiding. And is there a scenario where the top women in the sport, only one of them does all 3 of those, whereas one of them does all 3, but the other kind of spread out amongst them? I think that's getting rare.
Yeah, 100%. It'll be interesting to see if Jim next year goes back to redo the double, because I know this year he had like some bodily issues, according to like what I was hearing too, and it was like an injury kind of thing too. But I, it's interesting. Do you think if there was someone to do in the men's, do you think it's Jim, or like do you think it's still just so far out of reach?
Yeah. Oh man, it's such a tough thing. I mean, I think it'd have to be Jim or Killian. I think you could maybe make an argument for Tom Evans, but
Right. Yeah.
again, I think it's so unlikely, because just the fact that there's maybe 3 or 4 guys I could think of that I would say, you know what, if it's going to happen, it's going to be one of them, tells me that it's so unlikely, because there's those other, if I pick one of them, there's those other 3 that are gonna pick one of those other races and do it solely, and then it's gonna be hard to beat. Or you get someone where I wouldn't bet on Zach Miller winning Western States. I wouldn't be shocked if he did, but he wouldn't be my first bet amongst the top guys. But I could very much bet him winning UTMB. So what
Mhm.
happens if Zach Miller peaks for UTMB while, say, Jim is trying to do the double, or Killian's trying to do the double, or Tom Evans trying to do the double, and here's Zach sitting in the background logging 50,000-foot vert climb weeks and getting ready just to like show up and destroy everyone on race day. But and then we just have the growth of the sport too, because it's like this year at UTMB, no one's betting on the men's winner before that race. So we also have the scenario where someone just pops up that we're not counting on yet, and they had been kind of grinding on that course specifically, and then they put up a day like we saw this year.
Yeah, Vincent's performance was amazing. I mean, like not expected. Like I don't recall people picking him to be the outright winner, and here he comes having the day of his life. Like that was just a really really cool thing to see. Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see like if Jim takes another stab at it next year. But I agree. I think just the way that people race westerns so hard and then try to make that transition in is a tough thing too. But yeah, time will only tell. But it's really cool to see, to go back to the original point on the women's side. I'd love to see that there's like competition in there again, right? Because I feel like
Mhm.
even like the men's side, you look at this year, right? Yeah, sure, you could have said Jim's a clear outright winner, and I would have totally made that thing too. But then Rod Favard, not that far past him, and gave Jim the
Right.
fight for his life. And then right 10 seconds behind him was Hayden. Like, so it's
Mhm.
like so tight knit. Whereas like Courtney is just like dominated these races where like people aren't even close. Like it's not even like a contest. But now it's like Katie's going to be nipping at the heels, like if they're in a race together for sure. And they're both peaking for that. And I think that's super, super exciting. And, when you even just see like more women just doing amazing things at the sport, even beating dudes like, Tara, like we'll talk about on the AT, and just like
Yeah.
these incredible just feats of endurance. Like I love to see that competition, because it's going to require everybody to level up a lot more. And I
Mhm.
think, I, it, when you see someone like Courtney, I'd be curious, like to ask like Katie this question is like, I'm wondering if she sees that as like, okay, like this is where I can go, right? It almost raises the bar, raises the standard. And I think now with Katie kind of being to that conversation, like I'm sure you're going to get a lot of just other amazing women shooting for that caliber. And the gap I think will close like between Courtney and others for sure.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a fun spot to be in the sport. And and like you mentioned too, it's not just 100 milers anymore. It's not just like these iconic trail races. We have projects like what Tara just did on the Appalachian Trail, like just mind-boggling. Like the amount of the amount of length with something like that, to wrap your head around it, and then to go out and finish. What was her finishing? It was 40 days. What was it exactly again?
It was, so 40 days of the exact number here. It was 40 days, 18 hours, and 6 minutes flat. Which Carl Sabi's record, he went northbound, but still was the fastest time at the time. 41 days, 7 hours, and 39 minutes. So pretty much shaved off nearly a day, which is just amazing on the overall record, which is the coolest thing ever. The coolest thing about the attempt, too, two different things kind of stand out to me. Like the first thing is like she did hard rock. Like she did Hard Rock before
Yeah,
this as
that's right.
well, which is so freaking cool, right? And so I think like that's a cool thing. And you know, she was talking on a podcast that she did with Finn Melanson on Single Track, like saying that she was getting a lot of people saying this is a bad idea and everything. But you know, for her, she was like, I think that prepared me, like to be able to do like an 100-mile training day over all these mountains and everything like that too. Like, and if you look at Tara, like she races a lot. She's on
Mhm.
the I don't know if she'll go through this, and I gotta ask her, but she's on the race list for Javelina. Like she's on the entrance list. Is she? If I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if she does it. You know what I mean? Like if you look at her races over the year, she crams in tons of races in there too. So I think she just has a lot of that experience to like, you know, really like put herself to these big efforts and recover super fast. Which leads to the second thing I think is the coolest thing about the attempt. Like she was so behind on the overall record like the first few weeks into it. Like she was
Mhm.
lagging behind. I think she was behind by like a run rate of like 100 miles or something like that, which is huge. And then she like, you know, went from like 40 mile-ish days to then 50s and 60s, cut her sleep out and just like pretty much from like a mileage perspective, like negative split it, which is just
Mhm.
so cool to see because usually it's harder to do that in these longer distance events from what you kind of see anecdotally. So, but I think it has just raised the bar for like, man, like, and Tara even says this too. She talks about it. It's like, you know, women can shoot for these overall like men records. They can go for it, and like the gap is closing, and it's just such a cool thing to see her do that. Like, you know, not just for women, but just for what humans can do.
Mhm.
I think, in my opinion, I'm curious to see what you think, but I think this is the performance of the year for ultra running so far. That
Yeah,
I would say so.
it's gotta be up there. I mean, the argument against that would be just like, is the is the category something that wouldn't be?
Right.
Because I mean, FKTs and events, it's hard to, like, compare because you don't have, like, someone racing you, but, I mean, if we just look at, like, what was the most impressive feat in ultra running this
Yeah.
year, it's certainly up with a couple different performances. Um, yeah, and I mean, what you said about her pacing strategy is interesting to me too, because I think this is just a conversation where I mean, I've gone back and forth on this. I think like anytime I start feeling like I've kind of got it narrowed down a little bit more specifically as to like what the best pacing strategy is, something happens that sort of kind of like adds evidence to the other side. It's like it's almost timed perfectly for me when I'm just starting to get confident. It's just like, nope. And then you see something happen. I mean, like David Roche's Leadville, which
Yeah.
that's something else that happened since we last recorded too, is like
True.
one thing when I had him on I think you had him on your podcast too.
Hmm.
It seemed like David was on all of the podcasts, which
Made
he
the
should be
rounds.
after. Yeah, he should be after that. But one thing I wanted to really try to get inside his head about with the time when he came on mine was like, how did he feel in that kind of final 20 miles in terms of
Mm,
just like his motivation to push, how fresh did his legs feel? Because he had a pretty big positive split, and one of my arguments that I've been more convinced by with, like, a more even to negative split strategy is that that strategy is gonna put you in a position where you're gonna feel better maybe at the end of this race versus this inevitable kind of, like, what I think most people think is death march type mentality necessary in order to, like, maybe you're not actually death marching, but it's gonna feel like it's gonna be
right.
way more difficult where when you mentally unpack the race, you're thinking like there was the first 70, 80 miles, and then there was the last 20, 30, and the last 20, 30 carries so much mental weight. Whereas when you negative split, the mental weight balance, to me, the way I've perceived this historically for myself has been it's more distributed evenly. So you don't feel like you're
Yeah.
taking on way more of that at certain points. So I wanted to try to figure it out. It was kind of tough with David because he's a first time 100-mile finisher. So he
Mm.
really didn't have a perspective to weight against other than some other ultra marathons, which carry some value. But I think there's some specifics as you move to different distances that would be important, which just makes me more excited to see him do more 100 miling because I don't think he's going to always have days like he had at Leadville, and then maybe he'll have some perspectives that he can start kind of comparing this one to.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see what he does at Javelina in just a few weeks too.
Mhm.
Yeah, I and It is a really interesting thing too, because like I think, all the time you think of first time 100 miler, and like there's so much unique experience from that. Like I think even, you coached me through my first 100 miler too, and I do remember like you telling me, you're like, yeah, like once you get to that unknown, it is a hard place to be, and you need to take care of yourself up front to not get it so hard at the end. And I think even a lot of that weight carries more so in your first time going through the distance. So it's going to be interesting to see how he handles that at Javelina, where it's like now he knows what 100 miles feels like. Objectively, it's going to be a shorter time on course if he has even a great day out there, even like not his best day, right? Like just from like a time perspective with the less vert and altitude. But who knows? Like, I mean, like, is anything gonna be different with the heat? Is anything gonna be different with the running that's in there relative to the vert? Like, so, and you have some times when people, they have like amazing performances and then maybe not. But I think it's cool because he's very much cognizant of that from what I've been hearing. Like, he's like, yeah, like this is like the second sample size in an experiment he's kind of running through 100-mile training. So it'll be cool to see. And yeah, I mean, we can talk about like the Javelina stuff too. But I think, you've told me this too, and I think it's so true. It's like a really beautifully raced ran at Javelina as your first and fifth loops are the fastest. And I don't, I could be wrong, but I don't know if that's been the case over the past couple of years. Just because I
Mm-mm.
even think with golden tickets races, it's skewing more positive split. Whereas like if you look at someone like Tara, like she like mastered like the negative mileage split on a very long effort, and look how it paid off. So yeah,
Mhm.
it always gets me curious to see what's going to happen this year when it's going to be so brutally hot compared to the last few years. But
Yeah.
it's an
I
enigma.
think I think with like pacing strategy, if you pinned me down and said, "Okay, I wanna know what your current view of this is," I would say, like, I think, like, if you can put yourself in a vacuum and just
Mm,
say, "What strategy is gonna produce the fastest pace for me?"
mm,
It's gonna be some relatively small margin to either side of even,
mm,
but, like, if it's not negative, that doesn't mean like, the big question is, like, where is that margin, that range? Like, is it 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%? You could keep going and going. And let's say we establish that, then is there any variance inside of there that would be more beneficial for you to employ based on what actually happens, which is a race
mm.
where there's other people out there performing? And I
Yes.
think when you get the level of competition that we see at Western States and Javelina now, the best argument for a positive split to me would be a positive split that's not drastic, so probably inside a few percentage points of even, but it's putting you in a position where you're in the race because you're
Yeah.
not letting so I if what ultimately ends up happening is you get, like, a couple dozen guys going with that strategy, and only a handful of them are actually gonna be able to execute it right because they got their numbers crunched properly and their pacing and their capabilities properly calibrated, and then they're the ones who ultimately end up having that, like, slight positive split, whereas everyone else kinda blows up and has a really big positive split, or I guess the curious part about that would be if someone sat back and kinda tries to do what I did tried to do last year. I didn't execute it perfectly by any stretch, but, like, sit back and let kind of that lead pack go and then work your way up into the field.
Mm,
Is there margin for like someone who is like faster? Let's say there was like someone who employed my strategy from last year, but was a little faster than me and was able to get down into that kind of low 13, high 12-hour range. Um, are they gonna is that something that's just a psychological battle for the individual to be able to kind of sit off of
mm,
the very front and then all of a sudden like pop in there at the very end and steal it? Like, how likely is that? Is there an opportunity for that still? Is it too much stress to be sitting that
mm.
far back? I think there's a lot of individual components there and psychology there that you could make arguments at the individual level for, like, doing it or not doing it. Hey folks, just a quick reminder that this podcast sponsors include S Fuels. They have a 15% offer for you. Element Electrolytes, they have a free sample pack offer for you. John G Apparel has 10% off, and Delta G Ketones has a 20% off and free consultation offer for you.
Yeah, and even just thinking about that too. I think Aid Station Fireball did like some stats on it, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but I remember hearing something along the lines of like, for I think it was both the men's and the women's field, if like any of those athletes like weren't in the top 10 after like the finish of like loop one or something, like the chance of a golden ticket is like significantly small.
Mhm.
And it's like, I think maybe you hear that as like an athlete and you're like, well, I got to be in the top 10, I got to be in the hunt, or hear it all the time. It's like, I got to keep my eye on like where the first is, right? And of
Mhm.
course there's going to be people who get dragged out and led on like the really fast stuff as well too. So I think it's a really interesting component to kind of think about, just because there is that competition, there is like playing the field, there is all that stuff as well too. And you know, I think maybe over time, like once we've kind of, I don't want to say like hit parity in the sport with a lot of people with like stuff like that, but I think it just takes someone like a Nick Curry or like you who like go through and like execute these strategies to like one day kind of show it. Like I think it's Scott Traer in Black Canyon 3 years ago, right? I think he was in, I don't remember the exact number, like 30th place or something, like going into like Bumblebee or something like that. He was like way far back, and then dude gets a golden ticket, right? Like comes
Yeah.
comes in the top three. And he's been at like a guy similar with you. I mean, even last year, like you and I were running in the beginning, I think we were like 20th place or something like that. And then, you creeped up into top 10, which is awesome at the end, running sub 14. Like that's great. And so I'm curious to see like how that shakes out if the strategy does, because like it just seems like a lot of people just run hard and hold on for dear life at the end. And to me, it's just hard to think at like a mileage, like 100 miles, that it's hard to kind of go for, right? And then I look at people like Tara, how she's able to close so freaking strong at the end.
Mhm.
And granted, like, right, like to go to your point too, like for her, the only person she's like racing at is the ghost of Corel Sabi, right? Like
Yeah.
that's who she's racing out there. But there's no person, like there's no people in front of her, like, and so like I wonder with those kind of attempts, like if it almost like takes it a lot off, or even in these like fixed time events, if you're trying to go for like a certain record or something like that. I know you have a lot more experience in that realm than I have, like having just it like being like, okay, this is me against the clock or me against like that, if that conducively has someone to be more trusting of a negative or an even split than trying to go absolutely balls out in the beginning and just hold on at the end just to be at the front.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think part of me wants to think of it in the sense that if you really want to truly find your full potential, just the idea of planning a negative split is a hard sell because it's sort of putting yourself in a situation where you're going to limit yourself to some degree.
Mm,
Whereas like you have a race like that David had at Leadville, like he's either having a historic day for himself or he's blowing up epically. Those are kind of the options on the table.
mm,
And I think it works sometimes. So it almost becomes this thing where do you want to really, really figure out what you're capable of and know, like, okay, I could not have gone faster than that? Or
mm,
do you want to stack a bunch of like relatively close to your potential events, but not necessarily know for sure if you could have gone a little bit faster? Um, I mean, you could, I guess, assume a negative split's on the table that really isn't, and then but be close enough where you actually
mm.
run a slight positive, and then you do find that. So that's the argument. You could go back and forth. So really, what this comes down to is the number of opportunities or how many swings you take at this particular thing.
Yeah.
And with ultra running, it gets a little goofy because it's like these are long, stressful races. There's also like tons of variance amongst them. Very few people are targeting the exact same event over and over again, the way you'd see for like fast marathon running and things like that. Most people are going from, or most people are like what David's doing. He did Leadville. Now he's going to do Javelina. If he does well at Javelina, I'm sure he'll do Western States. Three very different courses. So it's like, how do you even
Mm.
begin to compare those and decide whether your strategy was employed properly or not when you have that many different variables from one event to the next?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and like the different courses definitely like has that, different variable thing too, but in the end of the day, like I think you answered the question right. It's like do you want to do your best? And I think sometimes like if David runs that Leadville course, no competition on there, I think you can get a faster time for sure. Like 100%. If it was just like him against him, like there's that, and I think the same thing's true with Javelina too. An interesting kind of thing too, even from just a recent experience for me. So I was out pacing and crewing Sarah Ostazuski at Moab 240 this past weekend,
Yeah.
and she got the course record in one. If you look like pull up her Strava file, especially in that race where most of the vert is backloaded to the end of that race, it's really even. Like she like nearly like even split this race over the course of 240 miles, and she took it like super chill in the beginning, you know? And
Mhm.
then she closes really strong with pretty much nearly all of the vert on that back half of the race. And you know, she ends up getting a course record, and you know, she came in even below the time that she had planned, like on her spreadsheet, which is like super super cool. But it's like, you know, she set herself up for that, and it's like when you set yourself up for that, and for her it was like, this is what I want to do, this is my plan. It was cool to see her take that as like, you know, she was very much looking at it as her plan, not like, oh, I need to be out in front or anything like that. And that was a cool like psychology moment. And even something that I'm taking in a javelina racing this year, like, you know, you've coached me through javelina 2 times before, and I've, you know, told you, I was like, yeah, I want to go for a golden ticket. And even for me, like, I think about that and I'm like, I think this year I'm just going to focus on running the best race I can.
Mm,
And I think that is the best strategy to get a golden ticket, is like to run the
mhm.
best thing that you can. Yeah, it's just an interesting thing to see like across this. And I do think this too. And this is very much like more of an anecdotal thing than a science thing. I think women are just much more disciplined with the pacing than men. Like I think I do like, I think there is, just like, if there's going to be someone who even splits or negative split a race, like I would be 100% betting on a woman than a man, because in the end of the day, like, you know, I think there's something about, and you know, this is speaking from you and I, both guys, and been competitive in the past. I think there's just a little bit more of the like kind of, you know, gusto in there that we have, that kind of can just let it get ahead. Whereas like, I think women are a lot more consistent. They're a lot more disciplined with it too. And
Ego
so I think,
control, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. I think we need to learn
yeah.
from the women a little bit more.
I wonder if that'll change to some degree now that women's fields are getting a little tighter,
Yeah.
where you'll see a little bit more aggressive start, like, a little more kind of, like, angst about staying with the lead
Mm,
pack, because kind of like what we were talking about before, it's like, I think when you have someone way out in front like Courtney, it's a little easier, I think, if you're one of the women in the field to say like, well, I should probably let her go because all evidence points to me like blowing up if I try to run step for step with Courtney. Whereas I think as the sport grows and competition tightens and tightens and tightens, and we have fields where it's like, oh, there's 10 women here and all could win if the day plays out in this certain direction. I think that maybe puts us in a position where there's a little more aggressive tactics, and we see it to some degree. I think, like, I mean, even last year at Javelina, I didn't pass Heather Jackson until the 3rd loop, and I
mhm,
finished
mhm,
5th overall.
mhm,
So, like, I remember on the 1st loop looking down at my watch, I'm like, "Oh, we're on men's course record pace," and she was right next to me. And I'm just thinking to myself, I'm like, "Well, that's an aggressive start unless she goes and runs, sub 13 hours." She ran an incredible fast time, like, I think it was 14:22 or something like that.
mhm,
It was, like, the 2nd fastest time on that course or something like
mhm,
that for the women's side of the field.
mhm.
But when you look at the splits there, it's way positive.
Yeah.
So, I think there's some signs that maybe that's shifting, and my big question is that driven by just the competitive side of these fields balancing out more than they were in the past, and now we're gonna see some pressure for that to happen versus, someone showing up and feeling like, "Oh, I can run a smart race, or I can run my race," because there isn't that the gaps between you and the person that you would try to compete against are big enough where you're either like, "I'm not gonna risk it," or, "I don't have to worry about them," kind of a mentality.
100%. Yeah, that's actually a really, really good point. Yeah, Heather is a good example to bring in that too, because I even remember running with you and we were like, she is booking. Like she was just way out too. And just did great. I mean, like she did awesome at Javelina that year. I mean, she did awesome at I believe it was CCC this year too. Like, and so yeah, who knows? Like maybe like even at Black Canyon, right? She did like a amazingly fast time at there when she did that a couple years ago. So all
Mhm.
that being said, like who knows if the women are going to follow too, and you know, go into that positive
Yeah.
kind of split mindset.
I would say, like, I mean, we don't have to get into the weeds too much with this, though. She really impressed me at Western States this year because
Yeah.
that's what she got as a result of winning Javelina. And my thought after Javelina was like, if she tries to employ that strategy at Western States, it will just end terribly because that course is going to make you pay more for that sort of an
Mm,
aggressive start, I think, than Javelina will. Uh, but it seemed like she sat off a little bit more this year. She didn't try to chase Katie early, and was she 6th this year at Western? She was in the
yeah.
top 10, well into the top 10, maybe 6 or
Yeah.
7th, something like that. I'm excited to announce that I launched a new group coaching option. So, to go along with my personalized one on one coaching options and my pre made plans that I have on my website at zachbitter.com, this year I'm starting a group of online endurance runners who want to work with me in a slightly different model. So, if you're interested in checking that out, just head to my website at zachbitter.com. Go to the coaching tab. From there, you'll be directed to the team coaching option, and you can sign up for that and get onboarded to join the group.
Well, it was interesting you said the thing about her with Western States because so the first year she did Western States, she took the fall DNF from Western States, didn't have it in there. And she is also, I will say to caveat this, she's a very humble person. Like she's just, super kind. She's amazing. But I remember like watching some pre-race interviews with her and she was like, the only goal I have out here today is to finish the race. Like, and she was like very adamant about that. And I'm wondering if like, because it was like, I just want to finish Western, that she ends up pacing a lot better. To kind of go back to the arguments we're saying before, where it's like, if it's you against you, are you going to pace smarter? So yeah, I'd be interested to have a conversation with her and like, pick her brain on that because I just remember seeing so many interviews where she was just saying like I don't care about like well she didn't say I don't care like specifically but basically she wasn't making a big stink on like I'm gonna be top 10 or I'm gonna like do this. It was like I just want to finish the race. I don't care if I'm this place or this place. And I'm wondering if that just led her to have her best days she can have out there.
Yeah. Maybe if we solved anything, it's that perspective matters.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it's like, it's just you run your best race. It's like could you pace smarter and race to your full potential as our friend Tara did out there too. Also the ultra athletes, man, I got to say the team ultra with the FKTs this year. I mean, you got Tara on the AT, you got Kyle Curtin on the CT and then Jeff on CT other direction. Like it's just ultra is like becoming the FKT brand of choice here.
Yeah, that would be fitting, I think, with the way the Lone Peak is done with the through hiking community over the
Yeah.
years.
Yeah, it is the
That's funny.
official shoe of the FKT.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, something that we've talked about in these episodes in the past too, that I don't always see discussed frequently on kind of the news and stuff are some of these longer timed events and things like that.
Mhm.
So, like, there's been so much excitement in that world recently as well with the more kind of road track timed event, multi-day type stuff to, I mean, the Self Transcendence 3,100 mile event is out in New York, and there's been a few finishers at this point, but that's currently ongoing. And then, I mean, just with we've always kind of seen maybe a little bit of a less of the sport growth over the last maybe decade or so go towards some of the more, I would say, historic events. Because when
Mhm.
you look at like the history of trail running in mountain 100 miles, we don't go back that far. But when we get into like the 100 mile, the 24-hour multi-day stuff, we're going back hundreds of years in some cases with these things. And right now, on both the men's and the women's side, we're seeing some of these records start to fall again, which is really cool. Not just like the 100-mile stuff or the 24-hour stuff, which we've seen a little bit more recently, but things like the 48-hour and the 6-day event. And when you look at this, just in the last, like, if we go like, I think maybe even a year and a half, we've seen the women's 48-hour record get broken twice.
Mhm.
We've seen the women's 6-day record get broke twice in this year within a few months of one another. We've seen the Canadian 48-hour national record go down. We've seen the men's 6-day record go down. So it's like we're starting to see some attention kind of go back to some of these more historic multi-day, long events. And I think that's kind of cool too to see like the diversity in the sport events start to kind of see that uptick kind of continually be explored.
Yeah, and I'm wondering too if that's like just the natural progression of just the overall sport of ultra running growing and like with it's like kind of like the numbers thing where it's like people maybe do 100 miles they feel like they've done that and then they go into other stuff or there's just more attention on those things. Like I'm curious like where a lot of that growth comes from and maybe it's even just like the prominence of these like longer distance events starting to get more attention like to the forefront, right? Because they now obviously trail and ultra running coverage is the best it's ever been. I mean, we got live stream race of 200 miles, like they live stream Desert Solstice, and it's like, for a while it was really like if I'm recalling when live streaming was really first a thing, it was really only reserved for like Western states, and UTMB was like very, it was like very much the premier kind of events. And I think now where you get like a lot more news coverage around like all this other stuff, it like gets the eyes on it. And I think it gets people thinking like, oh, can I do that? And it's almost just kind of like, you know, the effect where I think when you get things like you see people just doing these crazy long events, again, it gets people to question and try to push themselves like even further beyond just that too. I mean, even so, even on like not even just like the kind of more obscure and non popular records, right? I mean, going back to David, like that Leadville course record was around for a very long time, and it's not like Leadville wasn't
Mhm.
a popular race. I mean, like you had pretty competitive fields, relatively competitive fields over the years. Like Javelina stood for a while too, and you know you're getting these course records that are just getting mowed down, which is
Yeah.
just such an interesting thing to see. So, but I'm curious, like, what do you think a lot of this more fixed time, multi-day effort thing? Where do you think a lot of that growth is coming from?
Yeah, I think some of it is kind of what you were alluding to. Like we're getting some publicity for them. Like they're
Yeah,
showing up. So I think that works in two ways. One is there's a lot of people that are getting introduced to ultramarathon running over the last few years. I think the pandemic drove a lot of that too.
yeah.
The growth of sport drove a lot of that. Like you said, media like promoting it, showcasing it, getting it into the hands of people who otherwise wouldn't even know what it is big so people coming into the sport are aware of these things, whereas think of it this way. For a time, I held the 100-mile world record. When I got into ultra marathon running, I didn't even know what the 100-mile world record was. So
Mm,
it's like I knew what Western States was, I knew what Trail Ultra was, but it's like I had to enter the sport before I even knew. I mean, and we wanna make it even more absurd. When I ran the 100-mile American record the first time in 2013, I didn't know the 12-hour world record existed, and I was told at 89 and it was like 89 and a half miles into the race that I was on pace for the world record for 12s. And that was the first time that entire day that I even wrapped my head around, like, the idea of that being something I should be targeting,
oh my gosh.
which was kinda great because it allowed me to refocus and target something new, and it kind of, like I ended up running, like, 4 seconds per lap faster for the last, like, hour or so of that race because of that, I think, um but yeah, I mean, it's just like I think like that's changing now where now some people their introduction to the sport is because they heard about a timed event. And a lot of that is big publicity things talking about it, like me getting the opportunity to go on Joe Rogan twice, put
Yeah.
like track timed event stuff. Uh Cam Hanes, when he went on Rogan and talked about his Moab 240, he also talked about a 24-hour he did on a track. Same with David Goggins. They talked about some timed event stuff. So these guys who have way bigger reaches than I do are going on podcasts that have way bigger reaches than the sport has, and actually sharing that side of the sport a little bit, I think makes a big difference. And then I know we've got a topic on this all in of itself too, but then you have someone like Camille Herron who
Mm,
has been historically, I mean, she's definitely more than just a road track timed event person. She's done well at all sorts of different events, but she's broken 12 world records on timed event type courses and kind of flat, more runnable stuff. And then also won comrades, also won Spartathlon in course record fashion. So it's like you get a name as big as Camille Herron making a name for herself within that side of the sport. It also invites people who are in the sport to think,
mm.
oh, here's another aspect. Maybe I'll get curious about this. Maybe I'll go and try a 24-hour, or maybe I'll go try a 48 hour. Maybe I'll try a 6 day. And I think the appetite for just getting curious with these different events is getting just larger, and we're going to continue to see growth across the board and maybe even a little bit of a balancing because when you look at opportunity in terms of like what people will have access to, a lot fewer people have access to Western States and UTMB than they do a high school track that's putting on a 24-hour event.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think about you have raised good points. I always call it like the David Goggins effect. I felt like when Goggins came out with that book, I felt like there were so many more ultra runners, right? And he
Yeah,
made it, whether or not you agree or disagree with Goggins, like he made it accessible because, like, you know, you look, he's a guy who's like 300 pounds multiple
yeah.
times running ultras. I think it's gotten people there. And I'm sure you've seen this as a coach. I know even for me, like, even from when I first started coaching to now, I get more people come to me and they're like, I want to do 100 miles. And I'm like, okay, great. Like, what's the longest you run before? And they're like 13
I've
miles.
never run before.
Yeah, exactly. Or like, I never run before. Like, I haven't even started. And it's like, I can't even imagine that was a thing like 4 years ago. You know what I mean? Like when I first
Mhm,
started running, I thought like I didn't even know 100 miles existed. And when I heard of it, I was like, that's insane. Like that's going to take me a long time to get here. But now I think it's like you're getting that accessibility factor. So it's like the Goggins effect. And then I also call it like the Aravaipa effect because I look at Cocodona, right? Like Cocodona never really sold out. It kind of had like a forced sellout this year with the permits, but
mhm,
it kind of like made it to the end. They have this live stream where like thousands of people are watching this thing. And then this year, like they open up registration during the live stream, which is a very smart move on Jamil's part to do so. Race sells out in like 2 weeks. And I
yeah,
think that there's no coincidence on that with just like getting the visibility on it, right? And I run
mhm,
far, like now they're like touting these like 12-hour races, putting the results in there, like all this kind of stuff as well. Like I think it's just like the distribution and putting it on the forefront. And then it really just takes someone like a Camille, with Further or like Goggins or like Cam Hanes or like even just like you said, like being on people like Joe Rogan with these massive audiences. It's like that's how these things like grow, right? It's like and even so, like I'm curious, like with Desert Solstice this year, the field looks so freaking competitive. That there's people going after Nick's record this year.
mhm,
And so last year was obviously not a very competitive year just with worlds in the mix, but I'm
mhm.
curious to see like how that with that live stream that Aravaipa does at Desert Solstice, with it being so competitive as it is this year, like are we even going to get more growth in fixed time? Like because I remember
Yeah,
what got me like really interested in fixed time was seeing Desert Solstice and was seeing Nick, rip off 170 plus miles in 24 hours. Like that was a cool thing for me, like first getting into the sport, like seeing that stuff.
yeah,
So yeah, I'm curious. I think after Solstice this year, it'll be another kind of big bump with the visibility effect there.
no doubt, yeah. Yeah, and then it'll be interesting to see where all that stuff goes, and if we look at timed events that have really jumped forward and maybe even matched some of the performances in the trail side, I would say the 24-hour does that when you look at, like, Sorokin's 198 miles and, just absurd numbers where you can make an argument for that being one of the best performances in ultra running history and, short loop timed event, so interesting stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think, one other topic that's been in the news maybe a little bit less the last week or so, but was the hottest thing. If we would have recorded this episode 3 weeks ago, we would have led with this story because it was like almost mainstream media
Yeah.
related, like, I guess, controversy at the end of the day, where we were talking about Camille's athletic achievements, which are long as the eye can see. Unfortunately, she got hung up in some controversy, which basically was what I would consider, like, problematic behavior,
Mhm.
um, but it was like if it was in isolation, if it was like this one thing where I mean, I should probably give some background, although most people listening have probably heard the story at least, so they know what we're talking about here, where essentially what happened was Camille and Connor, her husband, went into Wikipedia and made a bunch of adjustments on both, her page and some of her competitors' page to essentially make her look better than others or denigrate others and things like that, which, the one thing I actually this is a total sidebar, but, like, I didn't realize that Wikipedia was like that it was frowned upon to go in and edit your own page. It makes sense to me now that it's been described to me, but I've just never engaged with Wikipedia in a way that would, like, teach me the ins and outs of it. So, like, when I was actually following this story a little bit, I was looking at this, oh, the Wikipedia community, it's like no go. Like, you do not touch your own page. You don't create
Oh
your own
wow.
page. It has to be because it's their idea with it is it's not like, oh, this is my Instagram social media publicity thing. It's
Right.
like we want this to be super balanced, super unbiased. I mean, you're going to have debates along all sides as whether they accomplish that or not, but generally speaking, if you're seen going into your Wikipedia page and making adjustments, you're going to get yourself in trouble. So she did
Mhm.
that to herself. It kind of got pinned to her because they had IP address. They knew it was her and or Connor, and they sort of tried to deny it at first, but then it became obvious through the article by Canadian Running Magazine, which kind of like covered the story initially, that this is sort of pinned to you specifically because IP addresses are sort of signatures online. And then it's like, we never really got a very like concrete explanation towards it or any sense of, like, maybe remorse along the, like, "Yeah, I shouldn't have been screwing around with other people's Wikipedia pages." And, yeah, that's a problem, but I think, like, holistically, if that had been, like, the only thing, then we probably move past it a little more. Because what the other narrative I see following this was such a big story, and this actually highlights what we were talking about before of how big the sport's actually getting now. This story was so big, it was getting covered by, like, big media outlets, like, I think the New York Times published something on it, the Washington Post might have, Runner's World did. It got really big to the degree where, like, if you Google Camille Herron now, that's gonna come up just as much as any of her amazing accomplishments, and it's like, yeah, to some degree, I think, like, there's a couple things going on there. It's like, one is the sport's big, it's visible, and that is such a clickbait thing to
Mhm.
sell. It's gonna get jumped on like crazy nowadays, and it's gonna ride that media wave. And then on top of it, I think, like, if you look inside the ultra running community, I think there was maybe a few things that were done over the years that just kind of boiled things up to where this was kind of like a straw that broke a camel's back type of a scenario versus it being like, okay, this is in isolation. We
Mhm.
should just like be a little more understanding of that. But when you kind of look at just some of the online behavior that had went on with Camille Encounter over the years, it just points to this being something that's a little more reoccurring, all the way to the point where, I mean, we talked about Victoria Brown's 48-hour national record at Canada. When she set that, um, Canadian Running Magazine ran an article, and Camille and Connor reached out to them trying to get them to retract the article.
Mhm.
And I mean, this is a national record in Canada.
Mhm.
So it's like, what's the point of that? Like, other than the fact that when Victoria ran that time for that 48 hour, if you follow that event, like, she got third place at that event. So it's like, the Stein Rex ended up breaking Camille's 48-hour record at
Mhm.
that event. There was another woman in there who was right up in there and was a real throwdown, but Victoria Brown was in position late in that race, like, I think, like, almost 40 hours in, where it was looking like she was gonna be the one to break it. So it sort of felt like this sense of, "Alright, here's a woman who is clearly capable of threatening some of my records, and I don't want that to be the case." And in a lot of backdoor type of dealings like that, and it's just like, I think that's where people who've kind of followed some of that online rhetoric and things over the years with examples like that and others, were sort of aware that this stuff was happening a little bit. So then when this occurred and there was, like, a very concrete fingerprint pointing back, it was sort of like a boiling over effect where it was like a lot of people, I think, were airing grievances then that they had been holding on to for a long time that they just didn't feel comfortable with, or they were, like, adverse to doing it because, I mean, Camille has a big platform, and some of these other people don't. And then when you start getting into the world of cyberbullying, which Camille's been open about having been done to her, you find out that she's doing it, she and Connor,
Mhm.
or, technically, like, I guess as of now, they're saying it was all Connor, but I don't know how likely that is given kind of the number of things that have been coming up now. It's a really unfortunate scenario, and, I guess if there's a silver lining with it all, it's that I think the community would welcome them both back if they came out and said,
Yeah.
"Look, we made some mistakes. We can we understand it's gonna be hard for you to take us seriously for a bit of time, so we're gonna show you that we can, not behave that way." And I think people would welcome her back,
Yeah.
into the kind of the community, so to speak. But, that's gonna take an action on their side. It can't be something that other people do for her, and so far, like, that's kind of where that story ends right now, unfortunately, is, I mean, I feel bad for her because it's like I feel bad for her to some degree where it's like she felt like that was necessary to do
Mhm.
that for her to feel accomplished or whatever was I shouldn't pretend like I know what was driving the behavior, but part of me feels like there's a scenario here where it's like she had this relationship with, like, her identity being pinned to some of these records,
Mhm.
and that's such a hard thing to do because they're gonna get broken. They
Mhm.
just will. Like, they don't last forever, and now
Mhm.
they're gonna get broken quickly. Like, we're just not gonna see records stand long at all. So if you start making your identity records, and you make your identity holding a record versus being a part of this process of advancing the sport, you're gonna find yourself in a really miserable spot. You're gonna find yourself online disparaging people, and it's just gonna be a really rough, I think, scenario to put yourself in. So I think like if there's something for us to learn as a community, it's like let's learn to really be reflective of like what are we actually getting from these things of value outside of like the ribbons and rewards and that side of things, and try to like celebrate that too, because and we do that in ultra running, I think, to a large degree. We
Yeah.
celebrate a lot of things, but really making that something that people feel comfortable with, so that or not make someone feel like, oh, you were the record holder and now you're kind of nobody. Like I don't like that. That would be sad if that's how she felt after seeing that
Mhm.
happen. Um, but I think you get my point. I'll let you say what you want to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, a lot of things that I agree with 100% for sure. And, I do like really hope that, Camille and Connor come out and, take like not take ownership in the sense that like they need to atone, but it's just like, hey, like we will welcome you back. You know what I mean? Like I think the ultra running community is very forgiving enough to the point that we can come out and be like, okay, we get it. Like if she explains herself and all the things, said, yep, I won't do this again. Like people will. And she is one of the greatest runners of our time. Like
Hmm.
there is
Yeah.
nothing that's taken away from it. Like I heard Brett Hornig talk about this, and he was saying she was like, Camille didn't need to do anything that she was doing to be considered one of the best of all time because she is.
Hmm.
Like she totally
Yeah.
is. And you know, I really hope she does like, kind of come out and, tries to make peace with things too. And obviously, like, probably makes it a lot harder that, she got dropped by the sponsor with Lululemon, and she was like the flagship athlete for the running division over there on the women's side, right? Like, and I get it. It's probably a really, really tough place to be, but it's one of those where, I think we got to get into. But, I think you raised the really good overarching point in that. It's like, it's not about the records. It's not about, the accolades and stuff like that. Like, think about it like this, like almost just as many people show up for like the DFL in these big ultra marathons and they do the first place person.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Watch Golden Hour at any of these big races.
right. It's like almost the same amount of people. And I think that's such a cool thing because, someone told me this quote once. I can't remember who exactly it was, but it's always stuck with me. Is like when people see you, and it's not about, again, what people think of you, but it's like when people get inspired by someone, it's not necessarily by like the results they get, it's about how hard they try. Right.
Mhm.
And I think it's so awesome because it's like, here's someone who's like DFL in a race, like on like the list of the official results is last
Mhm.
place, but everybody's there cheering them on and everyone says they're an inspiration, and they are, like, they are inspiring. I think those people who are back of the pack are super, super inspiring. And it's like, if you can just see that, it's like doing the best you very can on that day is like the coolest thing ever. And it's like, yeah, like maybe your record gets broken, maybe it gets taken away, but it still doesn't take the fact that you got a world record, right? Like one of the reasons why I came to you, Zach, to work with you is like you broke the record for the world record on fastest 100-mile time. At the time I went to you, it wasn't, you didn't have the record, but I still see that and I'm like, that is awesome. You know what I mean? Like that is so cool to put together that. And it's like, doesn't matter if it's still standing or not. It's like you did the thing. Like that's what counts of it, right? Like if you go ahead and like, pin Scott Jurek or, Ann Trayson, right? You put them out in a race today, like, they're probably not going to be the top of the field. Does that mean
Right.
that they weren't one of the greatest of all time? Absolutely not. Like Scott and Ann, the sport wouldn't be there without those two. So
Right.
I think, I hope that as the sport gets more popular, that people start to realize that. And, I think it's inevitable, right? Like you look at a lot more things in marathoning world and, track and field, there's a lot more scandals with like doping and other stuff that
Mhm.
kind of comes out. And I think that's what happens is like when the bar raises, sometimes people, not saying this is different in Camille's case, but maybe like there's a lot of similar driving factors. It's like to be the best, like what do I got to do to like make that perception, right? Whether it is editing Wikipedia pages, doping, whatever, right? Like I think it's unfortunately an inevitable thing that will come up in ultra running, right? And yeah, I know we're at time too, but like an interesting thing to think about is like you have Aravaipa doing drug testing for Javelina and for Desert Solstice. It's
Mhm.
like I don't know. Like, Jason Coop even says he thinks like people are going to get wrecked out there. Not trying to make any claims on my end, but like, who knows what's going to come out and everything like that too. And it's a sad thing, but I encourage like anyone in the ultra running space, whether you're at the top or the bottom of the list on a race, it's like, be the best that you can and like find your self-worth in areas of that you can have like internally. And like, I think that's going to lead to not only a healthy individual look, but a healthy attitude in the sport that I hope that we keep as the sports keep getting popular, and more notoriety, more competition, because sometimes it doesn't. And, I'm hoping that's the case.
Yep. Yeah, we're going to learn a lot and sometimes the hard way as we grow. And I think this is an example of that probably. So
Exactly, man. Exactly.
awesome, Joe. Well, I know you have to get going, but it was great to sit down and chat and kind of cover some of the stuff that's happened the last couple of months. I look forward to maybe getting on with you again after Javelina and chatting about anything that happens between now and then.
100%, man. Yeah, excited to chat after Javelina, and then we'll have Desert Solstice season coming up and lottery
Fun
season
stuff.
coming
Close the
up.
year.
So a lot of, and then people picking race schedules. So it'll be a fun time, Zach. But I'm looking forward to seeing you and Nicole out in the desert. Best wishes to Nicole out there on the day in there. She knows that course very well and has done very, very well out there. So I'll be rooting for a big time out there. It's gonna be awesome.
Yeah. Well, we'll be cheering for you out there as well. And just before you go, where can people find you? Everyday Ultra podcast, coaching, social
Mm-hmm.
media.
Yeah, thank you so much. So Everyday Ultra podcast, you can find podcasts wherever. I'm best to reach on Instagram at Joe Corcione. All this stuff is, if you're ever interested in, coaching any of that stuff too, just shoot me a DM. And I always say this too. I have to say, like, the reason why I'm a coach today and as good as an athlete as I am is I worked with the man on the other side of the mic here, Zach Bitter. So seriously, he's a great coach, great guy. You're listening to the podcast, so obviously, you're already someone in his world too. But Zach's a
There
great
might be
coach.
some
And
haters out there listening in here.
oh yeah, just editing both of our Wikipedia pages or something like that. I don't even have one.
Not yet.
Not yet. But I can't make my own apparently, or else I'll be
Yeah.
canceled
Don't do that.
by the
Wait for someone else
Wikipedia
to do it.
community. Yeah. Awesome, man. Well, thanks so much, Zach.
All right, Joe, take care.
See you, man.
Here are some discounts and promos for the HPO sponsors. S Fuels has a 15% site-wide discount and right now are running a free 30-serving pack of their S Fuels Train product with promo code HPO Train. Hurry up on this window. They have a limited number of supplies. Go to sfuelsgolonger.com, promo code HPO Train. John G. Apparel has 10% off with promo code BITTER10. Check out their AFO shorts if you're in the market for a new pair of running or gym shorts. That's johng.com, JANJI.com. Element Electrolytes has a free sample pack with purchase and satisfaction guarantee, meaning if you don't like it, they will give you your money back, no questions asked, and you don't even have to return the box. Go to drinklmnt.com/HPO to get that free sample pack and try out all their flavors with your purchase. Finally, Delta G Ketones has 20% off with BITTER20 promo code, and they also offer free consultations to help you assess how their product would best fit your lifestyles. Head to deltagketones.com. All links, promos, and discounts can be found in the show notes as well as every episode landing page. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.